Part 7, Omega-3 and SPM-Focused Intervention. Chapter 19, Why Most Omega-3 Supplementation Fails. Most omega-3 supplementation fails because people expect a signaling result from what is actually a structural and phase-dependent problem. They take fish oil as though it were a simple anti-inflammatory drug, something that should lower symptoms directly and predictably by virtue of entering the body. But omega-3 does not work that way. EPA and DHA are not finished therapeutic actions. They are precursor materials that have to be absorbed, transported, incorporated into phospholipids, preserved within membranes, released under the right conditions, and converted downstream into mediator families capable of changing the direction of inflammation. Even then, those mediators still need to enter a tissue environment that is capable of receiving late-phase signals and acting on them. If any layer in that sequence is weak, the person may still be swallowing omega-3 while failing to generate meaningful resolution biology. The supplement does not fail in a mystical sense. It fails because the body is being asked to produce completion from architecture that was never rebuilt enough to support completion. The first reason supplementation fails is that most people are not actually dealing with an omega-3 deficiency alone. They are dealing with omega-6 dominance, oxidative membrane instability, poor barrier integrity, persistent cytokine signaling, enzymatic crowding in COX and LOX pathways, low-grade endotoxin exposure, mitochondrial strain, and chronic re-triggering of the front half of inflammation. In that environment, adding omega-3 is like adding better materials to a site that is still being actively damaged faster than it can be repaired. The body may absorb some of the EPA or DHA. Some may enter circulation. Some may even incorporate into membranes. But the tissue receiving it is still organized around escalation, not completion. The inflammatory event keeps restarting before the later phase mediator environment can gain control. The person then concludes that omega-3 does not work, when in reality omega-3 entered a system that was too inflamed, too unstable, or too poorly sequenced to use it well. A second reason is poor membrane incorporation. Omega-3 only becomes biologically meaningful when it stops being a transient nutrient in circulation and becomes part of the phospholipid reservoir from which future signaling will be drawn. That takes time, turnover, and repeated remodeling. Most people evaluate omega-3 too early, or they use it in a body whose membranes remain so heavily dominated by omega-6 derived substrate that the EPA and DHA never achieve enough influence to materially change the releasable pool. In that case, the person can technically be taking omega-3 without substantially altering the architecture of future inflammatory behavior. The supplement is present, but the membrane is still mostly speaking the same old language. That is why many outcomes are weak or inconsistent. The intake occurred. The reservoir barely changed. A third reason is that people misunderstand what kind of result omega-3 should produce. If the expectation is that symptoms will drop quickly in a smooth, linear way, disappointment is almost guaranteed. Omega-3 is not a direct volume suppressant in the way many people imagine. It changes structural conditions and future mediator potential. That means its effects are often delayed, threshold-dependent, and highly nonlinear. A tissue may need to cross a certain level of EPA or DHA incorporation before SPM biology becomes meaningfully stronger. The body may need a reduction in oxidative burden or a partial repair of gut and vascular barriers before the same omega-3 intake starts producing noticeable changes. A person may feel nothing for a while and then improve once enough variables align for resolution activation to occur. Most supplementation failure is really a mismatch between linear consumer expectation and nonlinear physiology. The fourth reason is oxidative damage. EPA and DHA are highly unsaturated, which makes them biologically useful and chemically fragile at the same time. If the person is living in a state of repeated oxidative stress, poor antioxidant capacity, chronic glycemic volatility, inflamed adipose tissue, poor sleep, mitochondrial dysfunction, or persistent environmental inflammatory load, the omega-3 entering membranes may be damaged before it can be preserved and later converted into useful pro-resolving mediators. In that case, the person is not just low in omega-3 function. They are poor at omega-3 protection. The problem is no longer simply how much substrate is being consumed. The problem is whether the substrate can survive inside the tissue long enough to become part of a coherent resolution program. A fifth reason is enzymatic bottleneck. EPA and DHA do not move through empty pathways. They compete with arachidonic acid inside shared COX and LOX systems, and those pathways are often already heavily occupied by initiation-heavy traffic in chronically inflamed tissues. If arachidonic acid-derived signaling dominates the membrane reservoir, an inflammatory environment remains stuck in early-phase logic, then omega-3 derived substrate may never gain enough downstream priority to produce strong resolvin, protectin, or mycin output. The precursor is present, but the conversion is weak. This is one of the most common hidden failures in omega-3 use. People assume intake alone determines effect, when in reality the body also has to route that intake through pathways not already crowded by a more dominant inflammatory substrate culture. The sixth reason is that many people use omega-3 while continuing to maintain the diet and tissue environment that created the problem in the first place. A body saturated with industrial omega-6 input, repeated ultra-processed food exposure, glycemic volatility, intestinal irritation, low protein sufficiency, poor micronutrient density, and constant metabolic overstimulation is continually rebuilding membranes in the wrong direction. Adding fish oil into that environment may help somewhat, but it is often being asked to swim against a much larger structural current. The membrane is still being edited daily by a system organized around instability. In that context, omega-3 supplementation becomes additive rather than transformative. It never gains enough control over the reservoir to shift the body into a truly different inflammatory future. The seventh reason is wrong goal matching. EPA and DHA are not interchangeable, and most supplementation strategies ignore that. If the dominant problem is persistent inflammatory traffic, vascular irritation, and repeated immune escalation, then EPA-heavy strategy often makes more sense because it more directly alters inflammatory mediator competition and feeds E-series resolvin biology. If the dominant problem is neural instability, membrane fragility in high-precision tissue, poor tissue protection, and weak cleanup, then DHA becomes more important because it supports specialized membranes and generates protectins and mycins more directly. Many people take a generic omega-3 product without asking what branch of resolution biology they are actually trying to support. The result is not always no benefit, but often an underpowered or poorly targeted benefit. The eighth reason is that the body may simply be too stuck for supplementation alone to carry the whole burden. If the person is in a true stuck inflammation state, then omega-3 enters a system with incomplete debris clearance, persistent cytokine signaling, low thresholds, poor macrophage finishing, mitochondrial strain, and ongoing barrier-derived retriggering. In that situation, omega-3 can still be valuable, but it is no longer the whole intervention. The body needs cleanup, not just substrate. It needs reduced provocation, not just precursor. It needs a membrane environment capable of preserving and using omega-3, not just swallowing it. Most failure in omega-3 supplementation is really failure of reductionism. The supplement was expected to solve a resolution problem that was much larger than substrate insufficiency alone. Seen clearly, most omega-3 supplementation fails because people use it like a symptom tool when it is actually a structural input into inflammatory completion. It cannot reliably work in a body that refuses to incorporate it, cannot protect it, cannot convert it, cannot stop re-triggering the front half of inflammation, or cannot execute the metabolic labor of repair once the relevant mediators are produced. Omega-3 is real. EPA and DHA matter. SPM biology matters. But they matter inside a hierarchy. First, the membrane has to change. Then the substrate pool has to change. Then the enzymatic and inflammatory environment has to allow mediator class switching. Then cleanup and repair have to become possible. If those steps never happen, the supplement appears weak. If they do happen, omega-3 stops looking like a failed supplement and starts looking like what it actually is, one of the body's major material requirements for ending inflammation intelligently. Insufficient substrate for SPM production. Insufficient substrate for SPM production means the body is trying to execute the resolution phase without having stocked enough of the raw material required to do it well. This is one of the most important hidden reasons omega-3 strategies fail. Specialized pro-resolving mediators are not created from a vague anti-inflammatory tendency. They are created from actual fatty acid substrate, primarily EPA and DHA, that must first be incorporated into membrane phospholipids and preserved there as part of the tissue's future signaling reserve. If those membrane pools remain poor in EPA and DHA, then when inflammation begins and phospholipids mobilize fatty acids from a membrane, the body simply does not have enough omega-3 derived material available to generate strong downstream resolvin, protectin, and mycin output. The inflammatory program can still begin because arachidonic acid-heavy initiation substrate is usually plentiful. What becomes weak is the chemistry of completion. This matters because the body does not resolve from intake in the abstract. It resolves from what was actually built into tissue. A person can consume small amounts of omega-3 and still remain functionally undersupplied if those amounts never produce meaningful phospholipid remodeling. In that case, the membrane reservoir remains dominated by omega-6 derived substrate, especially in tissues already shaped by long-term modern dietary patterns. The result is a body with plenty of material for icosanoid-heavy early-phase inflammatory signaling and too little material for later-phase pro-resolving mediator generation. This is not just a nutrient shortage. It is a built asymmetry in inflammatory capability. The body is structurally prepared to start more strongly than it is prepared to finish. Insufficient substrate also explains why low omega-3 status is more serious than a simple deficiency model suggests. If EPA and DHA are underrepresented in phospholipid pools, then not only is SPM production weakened, but membrane behavior itself is altered before any mediator is produced. Receptor environments shift, substrate competition remains tilted toward omega-6 pathways, and the tissue enters inflammatory stress already biased toward escalation. Then, when the later phase should begin, the body reaches into the membrane reservoir for completion-capable precursor and finds too little there. Resolution pressure remains weak not because the tissue does not want to resolve, but because it was underbuilt for that task from the start. This is one reason small or inconsistent omega-3 intake so often produces disappointing results. The body usually needs more than token exposure. It needs enough repeated input to remodel membranes meaningfully, enough stability to preserve that remodeling, and enough downstream opportunity for the new substrate environment to influence inflammatory events. Until that happens, SPM production may remain functionally sparse even if some omega-3 is technically present. The tissue has not crossed the threshold from trace availability into usable reserve. From the outside, it looks like omega-3 is weak. Mechanistically, the real problem is that the substrate pool is still too thin to support a strong resolution program. Seen clearly, insufficient substrate for SPM production means the body is trying to generate the chemistry of closure from a membrane reservoir that was never adequately stocked for closure. It still has fuel for inflammatory initiation. It lacks enough material for inflammatory completion. That is why low omega-3 status does not merely reduce one beneficial pathway. It lowers the tissue's built-in ability to produce the signals that stop continued recruitment, improve macrophage cleanup, protect structure, and bring inflammation to a real end state. Poor bioavailability. Poor bioavailability is one of the simplest and most overlooked reasons omega-3 supplementation fails because the body cannot build membranes from fatty acids it never meaningfully absorbs. A capsule can be swallowed, a label can show a large milligram number, and the person can still end up with very little useful EPA or DHA reaching tissue if digestion, emulsification, absorption, transport, and incorporation all perform poorly. This matters because omega-3 does not act by symbolic intake. It acts by physical arrival. The fatty acid has to survive the digestive process, be released from its delivery form, encounter adequate bile and lipase activity, enter my cells, cross the intestinal surface, be repackaged into transport particles, and then ultimately reach the tissues where phospholipid remodeling occurs. If that sequence is weak, the person may be consuming omega-3 without actually supplying much substrate to the membrane reservoir that later supports SPM production. The problem is especially important for people with compromised fat digestion or poor bowel coordination. Omega-3 is still a lipid, and lipids require proper handling in the gut. If bile flow is weak, if pancreatic lipase function is limited, if intestinal irritation is high, if the person has gallbladder dysfunction, if digestive timing is poor, or if the supplement form is hard to liberate efficiently, then absorption may fall well below what the label implies. In that situation, the body is not refusing omega-3 at the membrane level yet. It is simply not being given enough at the absorption level to matter later. Poor bioavailability therefore creates a false sense of supplementation. The person thinks they are building future resolution capacity, but the body never receives enough usable EPA and DHA to remodel tissue meaningfully. Delivery form also matters because not all omega-3 enters digestion in the same structural state. Some forms are easier to digest, emulsify, and absorb than others. The fatty acid may be presented as triglyceride, reesterified triglyceride, phospholipid-bound, ethyl ester, free fatty acid, or inside an emulsified system, and that influences how easily it moves through the digestive sequence. A person using a form with weaker absorption characteristics, especially in the context of already compromised fat digestion, may obtain far less tissue delivery than expected. This helps explain why some people report dramatic differences between products that seem similar on paper. The issue is not only dose. It is how much of that dose survives the route from capsule to membrane. Poor bioavailability also interacts with timing and meal context. Fat absorption generally works better in the presence of a meal that stimulates bile flow and digestive activity than in a completely empty digestive context, especially in people whose baseline fat handling is already marginal. If a supplement is taken in a way that minimizes digestion rather than supports it, then delivered dose and absorbed dose diverge even further. Again, the relevant biology is not what was swallowed, is what reached phospholipid architecture. This becomes critically important in the context of SPM production because specialized pro-resolving mediators depend on actual membrane incorporation of EPA and DHA, not on nominal intake. If bioavailability is poor, then membrane remodeling remains weak, substrate competition remains tilted toward omega-6 derived pools, and the later conversion into resolvins, protectins, and marazins remains underpowered. The person may conclude that omega-3 does not help them, when the deeper problem is that the body never received enough absorbable substrate to build the reservoir from which help could later emerge. Seen clearly, poor bioavailability means supplementation fails before membrane biology even begins. The bottleneck is upstream. The fatty acid never meaningfully enters the system, so the body cannot store it, protect it, release it, or convert it downstream into the chemistry of completion. That is why omega-3 strategy cannot be reduced to label dose alone. The real question is how much usable EPA and DHA actually makes it into tissue. Oxidized inputs. Oxidized inputs are one of the most damaging and least appreciated reasons omega-3 strategies fail because the body cannot build clean resolution biology from damaged lipid material. EPA and DHA are valuable precisely because they are highly unsaturated and can serve as membrane-active structural components and later as precursor substrate for specialized pro-resolving mediators. But that same unsaturation makes them vulnerable before they ever reach tissue. If the oil itself has already undergone oxidation during processing, storage, shipping, encapsulation, light exposure, heat exposure, or time, then the person is not taking in a clean precursor pool. They are taking in a partially degraded lipid input carrying peroxides, aldehydes, and other breakdown products that no longer behave like intact membrane substrate. In that situation, the supplement is not just weaker than expected. It can become directionally wrong. Instead of supplying clean material for phospholipid remodeling and later SPM production, it adds oxidative burden to a system that already struggles to protect highly unsaturated fats. This matters because membranes are not improved by damaged building material. The body has to absorb, transport, and handle what it is given. If the incoming omega-3 is already oxidized, then even before questions of incorporation or conversion arise, the tissue is dealing with reactive lipid fragments rather than predominantly intact fatty acid substrate. Those damaged molecules can increase oxidative stress, interfere with membrane behavior, generate additional inflammatory signaling, and burden detoxification and antioxidant systems that should have been protecting clean omega-3 after incorporation rather than cleaning up damage before incorporation. The problem is therefore not only that oxidized omega-3 fails to support resolution, it can actively worsen the background conditions that make resolution difficult in the first place. Oxidized inputs also distort the meaning of supplementation outcomes. A person may take fish oil expecting reduced inflammatory continuation and stronger pro-resolving biology, yet experience little benefit, instability, or even worsening symptoms. In many cases, the question is asked at the wrong level. People ask whether omega-3 works when the more relevant question is whether the omega-3 arriving at the tissue was intact enough to function as precursor substrate rather than as oxidized debris. Highly unsaturated fats entering the body in a damaged state do not simply lose potency. They alter the biochemical environment into which they are delivered. This is especially problematic in a body already living under oxidative stress, poor membrane stability, chronic inflammation, and weak antioxidant reserve. The person is then adding fragile or already damaged lipids into a system that is already struggling to preserve clean lipid architecture. This is one reason quality control matters so much more for omega-3 than people often realize. With a stable nutrient, some degradation may reduce effectiveness without changing the fundamental direction of the intervention. With a highly unsaturated lipid, degradation changes the substance itself. A fresh, protected EPA or DHA-rich input gives the body a chance to absorb and incorporate intact substrate into phospholipid pools. A rancid or partially oxidized input gives the body a burden that resembles the very membrane damage and lipid peroxidation is often already trying to resolve. The distinction is not cosmetic, is mechanistic. Seen clearly, oxidized inputs fail because the body does not resolve inflammation from damaged precursor. It resolves from intact precursor that can be protected, incorporated, and later converted into resolvins, protectins, and marazins. If the input is already oxidized, then the intervention is compromised before the first membrane ever gets remodeled. The body is being asked to build order from degraded material, and that usually means less structural gain, less resolution substrate, more oxidative burden, and more confusion about why omega-3 appears unreliable. Lack of enzymatic conversion. Lack of enzymatic conversion is one of the central reasons omega-3 presence fails to become omega-3 function. EPA and DHA do not resolve inflammation merely by existing in circulation or even by being present in membranes. Their deeper value depends on what the body can convert them into once inflammatory sequencing reaches the point where closure should begin. That means release from phospholipids, routing through cyclooxygenase and lipoxygenase pathways in the appropriate phase, generation of E-series or D-series mediator families, and sufficient downstream influence for those mediators to actually redirect tissue behavior. If that conversion step is weak, then omega-3 remains structurally present but functionally underexpressed. The body is carrying precursor without producing enough of the later phase chemistry that precursor is meant to support. This problem matters because many people assume that increasing omega-3 intake automatically means increasing specialized pro-resolving mediator output. That assumption is too simple. Enzymes do not work in a vacuum, and they do not process every available fatty acid with equal timing, equal preference, or equal downstream consequence. EPA and DHA enter tissues already crowded by arachidonic acid-rich substrate, inflammatory cytokine pressure, oxidative stress, and repeated early-phase signaling. In that environment, COX and LOX traffic may remain dominated by initiation-heavy chemistry. The tissue keeps converting what it is most prepared to convert, and that often means the front half of inflammation continues receiving biochemical priority, while the back half remains comparatively weak. The result is a body with some omega-3 in storage and too little omega-3 derived resolution output in action. Lack of enzymatic conversion can happen for several reasons at once. One is simple substrate competition. EPA and DHA may be present, but if arachidonic acid remains far more abundant in the releasable phospholipid pool, then shared enzymatic systems remain biased toward eicosanoid-heavy initiation chemistry. A second is phase failure. The body has to undergo mediator class switching for pro-resolving pathways to gain meaningful control. If the tissue never shifts convincingly out of repeated recruitment and amplification, then the enzymes continue being used as tools of escalation rather than tools of completion. A third is oxidative instability. If the membrane environment is highly oxidized, then EPA and DHA may be damaged or functionally underused before they can be cleanly routed into useful downstream mediator production. A fourth is cellular context. The same precursor pool behaves differently depending on whether macrophages are in an effective finishing phenotype, whether neutrophil-heavy logic still dominates the site, and whether the tissue environment is actually prepared to respond to pro-resolving instruction. This is why lack of enzymatic conversion often looks like omega-3 failure from the outside. The person takes omega-3, perhaps even achieves some tissue incorporation, but little changes in a durable way because the body never translates stored substrate into strong resolvin, protectin, or mycin output. The membrane contains more potential, but the pathways needed to express that potential remain bottlenecked. The supplement appears weak, but the deeper defect is not necessarily intake. Is pathway expression. The tissue has the ingredients for completion and still behaves as though it only knows how to begin. Seen clearly, lack of enzymatic conversion means the body is underbuilt at the precise step where structural precursor is supposed to become functional resolution. EPA and DHA matter, but they only become decisive when the body can process them into the later phase signals that reduce continued neutrophil recruitment, improve macrophage cleanup, protect tissue, and support rheal closure. Without that conversion, omega-3 remains mostly stored possibility. The inflammatory program then stays biased toward initiation because the chemistry of completion never becomes strong enough to take command.